Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to look back 50 years to one of the most notorious incidences that happened in American history. It was 1969 in the month of August when Charles Manson and his clan decided to raid Celio Drive and commit one of the most gruesome murders known in U.S. history. It would also be known as the Summer of Love Coming to an End, the same year that Woodstock was performed, as well as Man Landing on the Moon. His book is Manson Exposed. It's a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder, and he's going to explain how, although Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecuting attorney, claimed it was the Beatles album that had the song Helter Skelter would be the one that would motivate him, that it's not really such, that there's actually a lot more to it than that. I'd like to welcome the Beyond 50 radio program today, our guest, Ivor Davis. Thank you for being on the program today.
Well, thank you for having me, Daniel. Nice to be on.
Now, you've got quite an impressive history. You were the journalist that was actually embedded with the Beatles in 1964 on their first U.S. tour, and, and here you were in the middle of all this. And that's, kind of getting the audience to understand you're not some kid that just decided to say, this Manson thing seems pretty miraculous, but you were actually right there just the day after that actually had happened that evening, weren't you?
That's correct. It's one of the situations that, don't forget, I was a foreign correspondent in America in the 60s when we didn't have the Internet, when people actually covered stories on the spot and didn't phone it in, if you like. So I was very fortunate to be a foreign correspondent for a large London newspaper which had 4 million readers every day. And, of course, as you would know or remember, Daniel, those were the days when people actually read newspapers. So I was fortunate to be there at the right time in the right place. And the Beatles came along, and then the Manson murders, which was a scene that, as those who recall the time, shocked and ended the 60s in such a horrible way.
Now, I remember I was actually 5 years old. I was growing up in San Pedro, California, and it was really quite alarming as I was reading your book to realize, as you would say, that actually Charles Manson was getting what you might call his doctorate degree at Terminal Island. And, I'll never forget always crossing the Vincent Thomas Bridge in Terminal Island. Back then they were shipyards, but now apparently it's much different than that. But to realize that something like that was that close to home, and that would be one thing. And then the other thing that was really alarming for me as I was reading, to realize that Dennis Wilson, the drummer of the Beach Boys, was so connected to Manson too. And my family, actually, my father's side of the family, his brother and family actually were very good friends with the Beach Boys.
Wow.
And I remember in 1985, as I was visiting them for the first time in God knows forever, we were talking about that, and he says, when Dennis Wilson died, they were like one of the first people they contacted. Now, of course, I didn't think much about it then, but could you imagine if I had even known, anything about Manson at the time? Well, what about this? So you really bring out a whole lot of crazy stuff in here, and again, this is my first time reading anything about Manson. I was familiar with him, and all that, but not like I am now, so.
Yeah, but don't forget, Daniel, you've got some excuses. I mean, you were a child, so
right.
So it rang a bell, but it didn't ring the big bell. And if you'd had the big bell rung for you, you would have known, as you said, you knew the Beach Boys, and I was around at the time, of course, were hugely successful. And the amazing thing was that, of course, Dennis was the drummer. Dennis was the really big rebel. And all the Beach Boys, you know the Beach Boys, you know the history. I mean, Brian, the fact that he is alive today is a miracle, because Brian Wilson, when I knew him, was in a catatonic state. I mean, I would go to parties that Derek Taylor, who helped do PR for the Beach Boys. Derek Taylor was the PR director for the Beatles, and Derek would invite me to his house in Hollywood in the 60s, and Dennis would be there, but he would not be there. He would be there physically, but mentally he was gone. He'd sit there for 3 hours in a in a high-back chair. Nobody talked to him. He didn't talk to anybody. And he was, I think, drugged out. And there's no big secret because he's written about it extensively in his memoir about how he went through mental problems. So the Beach Boys were sun and surfboards and surfing, but deep down inside they went through their own family problems.
Now, as you write in the book, you were actually there by noontime the following day after the murders up at the Tate house had occurred. Now, and you actually had somebody who lived close by who was a friend of yours where you were able to get access to a phone. So how did you first, just to give our listeners an idea, first hear about this?
Well, back in '69, we didn't have internet. We didn't have incredible communications. So some of the news wires, AP, City News Service, which handled Southern California, put out a story saying there's been mass murders at a elegant mansion in Beverly Hills in a safe neighborhood, supposedly safe neighborhood. So we didn't know who was there. We didn't know who had been killed. I rushed from my home, which was 15 to 20 minutes away, to the house. And at the house, we were all gathered outside the electric gates while the police kept us out. And as the afternoon wore on, we suddenly learned the terrible news of who was the victims: Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, a friend, the hairdresser to the stars, and friends of Sharon's husband, Roman Polanski, a guy called Wojciech Frykowski's girlfriend, Abigail Folger, and unfortunately one young man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he got killed by the killers. So the story unfolded slowly during that beautiful Saturday summer's day, and we learned who lived at the house. Sharon Tate was pregnant, 8 months pregnant, and the story evolved from that terrible first day to quite a nightmare over the next few years.
And there's no doubt, because it took months for even the LAPD had no idea who was involved in this. And, so you can see how the press went bat crazy. And we're running all kinds of crazy stories on this whole thing.
Oh, they were. Daniel, what was happening was that for the first week or so, there was all sorts of stuff about Hollywood is a freaky place. There was drugs. There was a drug deal that went wrong. The victims were themselves perpetrators of drugs and all sorts of wild stories because the police didn't know. The police were baffled. And as you mentioned a moment ago, believe it or not, the case was unsolved for 4 months. And then when they finally solved the case, it wasn't brilliant detective work. What happened was one of the killers, a woman called Susan Atkins, was in jail for another murder, and she confessed to her cellmates, I should say, that she was the one that killed Sharon Tate. And the cellmates thought she was exaggerating, but eventually she gave them so much bloody details that they went to the prison authorities. The prison authorities got to the detectives investigating it. The detectives went to see Susan Atkins, and she blabbed. She confessed, and that was how they solved the case. Otherwise, who knows what would have happened.
And even more so, too, don't forget about, as you talk about the driver, was it Linda Kasabian, was also the one they said that without her, being able to put everybody there at the scene because she was driving the car, that they probably never would have been convicted.
Well, so what actually happened was as soon as Susan Atkins confessed to her cellmates, she was then going to become the prosecution's chief witness. However, the district attorney thought she was damaged goods. I mean, she was a killer. And so how could they use one of the most fiendish killers of the murders as their key prosecution witness? Fortunately for them, Linda Kasabian, who was the actual driver of the car, never killed anybody, but was participating in the drive to the crime scene, she became the star witness. She testified at a trial that I attended that went on for a year, and her testimony over 17 long, arduous days helped convict them all.
Now, Vincent Bugliosi, we had the opportunity, we've had him on the program twice before he passed in 2015 on his last two books. And I had some temptation to actually talk to him, but that wasn't the reason we were having it on the program. My first exposure, you might say, to Charles Manson and the knowledge of him actually happened, I think, in the early part of the 1980s based on the made-for-TV movie Helter Skelter.
Yes.
And so, this friend of mine was like, you got to see this. This guy did this. And I said, man, that sounds pretty, brutal, kind of a thing. And so really all I can remember from the movie was actually the last part where they're actually convicting Charles Manson in the movie. And so the next kind of exposure, you might say, would be, of course, the more frequent movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino, which you talk about later on in your book. And although it doesn't totally focus on Manson, it brings him into light. But here was what was really unique for me and why I got curious to want to see that movie is because I had done an interview about a year ago on the book Bruce Lee, A Life, which you also talk about very briefly in the book. And when they showed Bruce Lee, in this movie as part of the, I call it the commercial for the movie, I was intrigued by that, knowing that Bruce Lee was actually a suspect in these murders, or at least suspicious of that himself, because of the fact that him and Roman Polanski, he had actually trained Roman Polanski in the martial arts as well as Sharon Tate. So let's go ahead and talk about that bit of uniqueness right there and what was going on in Roman's mind, why Bruce Lee at least was one of the possible, he was suspicious like everybody was. This is how much it floored everybody.
Here's the thing, Daniel. I mean, some of the elements you mentioned in the last moment, we will talk about the film, but then Bugliosi you interviewed, and to be honest with you, Vincent put blood, sweat, and tears into the case. It became his calling card, and Vincent Bugliosi did work very hard to convict, and he got his conviction, even though I'm not so sure his motivation was a little bit crackpot, in my opinion. I mean, the Beatles lyrics made them do it is a little bit far-fetched, but there's so many elements that you want to talk about, and let's just touch on what you just mentioned, Roman Polanski. Now, Roman Polanski, don't forget, was in England at the time of his pregnant wife's murder, and when he got back, he was distraught, of course, very upset, and he did not have a clue, like anybody else, who had done it. So he, for some reason, felt that it may be members of his own showbiz community. And in fact, he believed, and I know this is hard to believe, but he believed that John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas might have had something to do with it. Now, why? Why did Polanski feel that way? Polanski knew that John Phillips knew that Roman had had an affair with John Phillips' wife, Michelle, and in his warped, tormented mind, Mr. Polanski thought that maybe Phillips was getting his own back on Roman for sleeping with his wife. I mean, in today's clearer air, it sounds ridiculous, and it was ridiculous. But you've got to realize that Roman arrived back, pumped, full of tranquilizers, and I saw the way he behaved. He was drugged out, and so he just decided to help the cops in his own inept way to try and find out who the killers were. And the Bruce Lee element, which of course is mentioned in the film by Quentin Tarantino, the reason that they thought that maybe Bruce Lee was responsible was that Roman thought, who do I know who could kill so many people in one foul swoop? Obviously, Bruce Lee is a master of martial arts or whatever. And so, again, don't forget, it was all coming from Roman's twisted, tormented, tranquilized mind. And so, of course, Bruce Lee had nothing whatsoever to do with it, although he's in the film. And if you like, we'll talk about that a little bit later on without giving too much away. But I'll just add one more thing, Daniel, and I'm sure you've seen the film, haven't you?
Yes.
It's a fairy story. So Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a fairy story. So Mr. Tarantino killed Hitler a few years ago in Inglourious Basterds. So
right.
he can get away with anything. And it was an entertaining film, I must say. I thought he recaptured 1969 rather brilliantly with the music and the ambience, with the personalities. But the story of the two stuntmen was really a fiction.
Right. As well as it all was to a degree, because it was the way he remembered or fantasized, about Hollywood. In fact, my wife did a wonderful review on the movie saying this is all Tarantino and shows the elements. It's really a unique on her Conscious Movie Review website. Anyway, but like I said, I was intrigued when I seen that Bruce Lee, when they were doing the commercial for it, because I had read, wow, I didn't realize that. Now, what I liked about the film, and we're not going too much into that aspect of it, but that they go to Spawn Ranch. Now, see, I knew something about a ranch, but I didn't, and here he actually recreated it because it's long since been burnt to the ground. But because of that, as I began to read your book, and I had these images, it all was easily coming alive for me. Wow, this is a kick in the butt, so.
Daniel, I will tell you this, that Tarantino in the movie captured the Spahn Ranch perfectly. It was a stinking, smelly, down on its luck, out of time movie ranch with very little electricity, a little bit of electricity. Not toilets were stinking. It was full of horse manure and flies, and people no longer went to shoot movies at the Spahn Movie Ranch. I mean, it was past its finest hour. And so they made a few shillings, a few dollars on the side, renting their sort of rather dog-eared horses to day trippers. And so when I went to the ranch, it was an eerie place. It was a kind of an unappealing place. And that's where Manson and the gang lived. Now, what I liked about the movie was he captured the kind of the evil core of that ranch. And poor old George Spahn is depicted in the movie by Bruce Dern. And when I went to see George Spahn, and I went in 1969 to the Spahn Ranch and spent three days talking to Manson family members not involved in the murder, it was a decrepit place. And I must say that Tarantino recaptured that place, the kind of children of the village of the damned feeling. It's scary, isn't it?
Yeah, it really was, especially as, you're reading what you read in your book, Manson Exposed. And so what I kind of wanted to do, too, is move in that direction, because especially with the idea that Helter Skelter was the motivating factor. And here's my contention about that. I found that, especially after what I've read, what you've written, which is, I got to say, it's really a page-turner. It was really enjoyable to read.
Thank you.
It is, and I say that, and I say to the listeners, if you've never known anything about this is a book definitely to read. But what I was really intrigued by was the fact that Vincent Bugliosi was so convinced that Charles Manson was motivated by the Beatles album, especially Helter Skelter, and what was it, Revelation 9, I think it was. And when you think of Charles Manson and the way you write about his history, I mean, this was a guy that grew up in a system that failed him in corrections, okay, especially as we were talking earlier about Terminal Island and how he was learning from pimps and thieves and so forth. And here is a guy that learned to survive. And somebody with that kind of mindset doesn't get easily influenced by secret messages and albums too much to make him take action. Now, maybe the rest of his followers would because of how he preached about that, but it was a really unique process of how he was brainwashing these people that he, had around him.
Yes. He did play the White Album, the Beatles' 1968 White Album, and on the White Album are the songs that supposedly inspired the killings, Helter Skelter. Now, if you look at the lyrics of the Beatles' Helter Skelter, and I've listened to them carefully, there's nothing whatsoever to do with killing anyone. It's about a a fairground ride in England. Paul McCartney sings about it. The other songs are Blackbird, Revolution. Manson manipulated his people into believing that the Beatles were sending him secret messages. I mean, it's ridiculous, I know, but... And then, when I heard that for the first time, when I spent some time at the Spahn Ranch, when I heard that, and I heard many Manson devotees who were not involved in the murders tell me that that was the reason for the killings, I thought everybody had lost their mind. And then, fast forward to July 1970, and I'm sitting in court, and Mr. Bugliosi stands up, and he gives this pitch about the Beatles' lyrics were the reason for the murders. I mean, I thought that Vince had lost his mind. But the amazing thing is, as you know, and as we all know, he managed to persuade the jury that this was the motive. Now, if you talk to Vincent, and Vincent, until his dying day, believed what he said, because his whole calling card, his trademark, his reputation, was built on the helter-skelter theory. And if Vince had mentioned years later that maybe he wasn't quite right in choosing that motive, maybe it was a different reason, his whole career would have fallen apart. So whenever you challenge Vince, and if you challenge Vince and he didn't like what you said, he would give you a hard time. So I would ask you, Daniel, do you recall how Vince stood by his proposition of the Manson murders caused by the Beatle lyrics, didn't he?
Yes, I believe so. That's what I remembered, like I said, from the movie that I'd seen years ago. I was actually trying to find it again to go over it.
Yeah.
But when I see, and you've done some tremendous investigation, I mean, I'd hate to see what your office looks like. I can imagine you just have piles and reams of paper on this. But, when you outline the way it all comes together, you realize what you're saying makes more sense than obviously the helter-skelter theory does. And when you realize that there was one motivating factor that they believed they went up there to just basically kill anybody who was in the house, might have possibly been, and there was a thought that it might have been because of one Terry Melcher. Let's talk about him for a bit.
Yes, well, it fit in conveniently to Vincent Bugliosi's thesis. I mean, Terry Melcher had lived at the Cielo Drive house where, at the time of the murders, Roman Polanski and Sharon were living. And Melcher had moved out, and Charles Manson knew that Melcher had moved out. The reason why supposedly Manson had a grudge against Terry Melcher is that Terry Melcher went along to the Spahn Movie Ranch, auditioned Manson as a possible candidate for a new record album, and gave Manson the idea that he kind of liked his music. Apparently, Melcher didn't like his music as much as Manson liked his own music, so he then kind of ignored Manson and didn't give him the definitive answer. And so the idea was, Charlie was so angry at being rejected by Terry Melcher. And Terry Melcher was a record producer who'd done The Byrds, a lot of big albums. He was a hotshot record producer and also happened to be the only son of the famous legendary Doris Day. So Melcher was a high-profile guy in the record business. Manson thought he had snared Melcher, but he had not. And Melcher then tried to ignore him. And the idea was that Manson was so upset with being rejected by Melcher that he sent his killers up to show Terry that you don't play with Manson, you don't break your promises with Manson. I mean, that's not really the case, because I know for a certainty, and I know that Terry Melcher said he knew, that Manson knew he was no longer at the house. Manson just sent his killers out on 2 nights in August 1969, basically to cover the tracks of the murder a week before Sharon Tate's murder by a pal of his called Bobby Beausoleil. And it was a cover-up to try and put police off the scent of the killers. That was the reason. So Mr. Bugliosi's thesis worked, but it wasn't really the true reason for the murders.
Now, how has it been as far as the audience who have read your book? What has been the reaction to it?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
I was curious. How has the reaction to the book been?
Well, I've had some people who know the case very well, and they agree. They think that the Beetle thesis is hogwash. And I must tell you one other thing, which sounds as though it's self-praise for me, but in 1970, when the trial began, my first book on the Manson case came out. And in the book, I laid out the blueprint for the Beatles made me do it, the Beatles lyrics. And years later, Vincent Bugliosi's colleague, a guy called Aaron Stovitz, told me that Vincent got my book. And again, this sounds like I'm patting my own back, but Aaron Stovitz told me that Vincent took the thesis of my first book in 1970 and decided to go with the Beatle motive. So, you can make of it what you will. But anyway, that's because the problem was, how do you convict Manson, who was never at the murder house of the Sharon Tate house? How do you convict him of murder? You convict him of a conspiracy. You convict him of plotting, planning. And Bugliosi realized that maybe the jury would have acquitted Manson if he'd gone with the true reason. So he went with the helter-skelter reason.
Well, it worked in any case. There's no doubt.
It did. And, is it the ends justify the means, or is it the other way around? I'm always getting muddled up with that phrase. Yeah.
The thing is, too, I'd like to speak on at least one more aspect of it, and I think if there's any movie that should be made about this, it should be about the trial itself. I mean, you got a cast of characters in this thing, that you wished, and you sat through it for a year, but let's talk about a couple of the defense attorneys.
Well, I mean, you've got to realize this. The trial was a circus. Manson never testified in his own defense. Neither did one single member not one defendant testified. And the lawyers that were involved, Ronald Hughes, who represented Leslie Van Houten, had never handled a single case. He'd never handled a traffic ticket. He was fresh out of UCLA Law School. Day Shin represented Susan Atkins. He was an immigration lawyer, had no experience at handling crime. And we had a couple of lawyers that were maybe well-meaning, with a couple of lawyers that knew their stuff, and it was a mess. And what happened was that every time Manson decided to disrupt the case, he would misbehave and be thrown into a holding cell. And as soon as he misbehaved, the girls copied him. This worked well for Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor, because the jury could see that Manson was the manipulator. When Manson carved a swastika in his head, the girls did. When Manson started singing, the girls did. And the jury saw that Manson had the power to tell the other defendants what to do, and that's why they convicted. And the trial went on. And as I say, a couple of times, Manson tried to attack the judge with a pencil. Every time I went to the trial, every morning, you didn't know what to expect, and something unsuspecting and unsurprising or amazing happened. So it wasn't your traditional murder trial.
And also, too, there was one Ron Hughes, I believe, who was a defense attorney, and he ended up mysteriously dying somehow, and that actually kind of changed the game for at least, was it Leslie Van Houten?
Yes.
Okay.
Ronald Hughes was this young lawyer, fresh out of law school, never handled a single case, and about 2/3 of the way through the trial, he disappeared. And the court was thrown into panic. What do? Do you declare a mistrial? And it wasn't until 4 months after he disappeared that his body was found floating in a stream in Ventura County in the hinterland. A lot of people thought that Manson had ordered the murder of Ronald Hughes. I don't know. It was a bit mysterious that he should suddenly vanish and then show up dead. But the case continued, and Leslie Van Houten actually got a new trial, and then was after another trial, and then she was also convicted. And as I'm sure you know, all of the convicted defendants are either dead, like Susan Atkins, or still trying to get parole, like Tex Watson and Leslie Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel. Took his gold records, and but they stayed at the Dennis Wilson mansion in Sunset Boulevard in Pacific Palisades, where Manson met a lot of the showbiz greats. I mean, Neil Young and John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, and Cass Elliot of the Mamas and Papas. So Manson moved into the house with the girls, and poor Dennis Wilson, or maybe he wasn't so poor, availed himself of the drugs and the sex and all the other little fringe benefits that Mr. Manson provided.
Its own form of Caligula, in a way, if you will.
Yes, there you go.
I think what's interesting to note, too, about Neil Young, I wonder how he's feeling about the fact that he actually bought Charles Manson a motorcycle during that time.
Well, that's another amazing thing. But, I mean, he said, Neil Young, besides giving him the motorcycle, said he thought Charlie Manson's music was a little bit reminiscent of the young Bob Dylan. So go figure that.
Exactly. Well, Ivor Davis, I want to thank you for being on the program today. I know that you're traveling quite a bit and doing quite a few interviews. How can people find out how to get a hold of Manson Exposed? Well,
thank you for your kind words. There's 2 ways to get my book, and I hope people who are listening will. One way is to go to ivordavisbooks.com and order it from there, or you can also go on to Amazon Books and order it on Amazon Books. So thank you for your kind words about my book and for giving me time to talk to you about it.
Absolutely. It's been a wonderful pleasure to have you on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel. Bye-bye.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thanks for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.